prioritizing equity in all forms yields a thriving community with more positive outcomes for all citizens, regardless of race, gender, ability, or socioeconomic status. There are few more qualified to speak on the topic of equity than that of Jonathan Butler, Equity Manager of the City of San Antonio, Texas, and member of ICMA's Equity Cohort. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you all.
Really appreciate you taking the time. And to give the audience a better understanding of your story, what or who influenced your decision to choose public service as a career path?
That's a great question. There has always been something in me, Jesse, that has gravitated towards public service. I'm a son of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also a son of a person who was there at the March on Washington in the 1960s. And this idea of service and servant leadership has always been something that has been a part of me, my being, my upbringing. And I really think those were the earliest influences on me to use my voice, my platform, my gifts, my talents towards something for the public good. So I've always had these inclinations to lean towards public
All
things.
I can say is I'm glad that you found your way to the profession and are thriving in this space and doing your part to make a difference, especially in such an impactful role as equity manager. And given your immersion in this work with San Antonio, what does equity mean to you?
So, we've got a definition for it here in San Antonio, and we really do define it as fair and just outcomes and opportunities for all people. I often like to contrast this idea of equity, equality, and then racial equity. And I'll walk you a little bit, Jesse, through what I mean. This idea of equality, my mom describes it this way. My mom says, Jonathan, when you were growing up, you needed different things than your brother. So I didn't focus on this with you if he needed that. I focused on what you needed. That's the same way I really think about the concept of equity. When we think about equality, we think about everyone starting at the same place at the same time with the same things. Well, you and I both know that that's extremely rare in society and in life. And so, this idea of equipping people based on needs, servicing people and delivering services based on their needs, I think is extraordinarily important. And that's kind of how I think about equity. The contrast that I think is really important, though, when we talk about racial equity, we are really talking about actively working to dismantle and disrupt and really eradicate institutional and structural and systemic racism that have continued to contribute to negative and adverse outcomes in communities of color and primarily low income communities. And so I think it's important to think also as equity. When we talk about racial equity, we're talking about eliminating disparities. We're talking about in terms of bridging gaps associated with those needs in communities. And we are centering problem solving, knowing that we in government have played a role in creating those disparities and exacerbating those disparities, whether intentional or not. So I think all of those concepts are important to think about when we talk about equity.
What are examples of resources that have helped you in your own equity efforts?
I will say from resource guides, I think our website is a wonderful resource for the Office of Equity in San Antonio for things like tools, for things like practical ways of being able to really work to make sure that this work is operationalized. I think we've got some great resources there, and of course the usual suspects, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, Policy Link, and us at ICMA. One of the things we're doing at ICMA is we're rebuilding our toolkit. So we want it to be much more serviceable, much more user friendly, and much more of a guide, no matter what level you're starting out on the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. We're writing that manual toolkit, if you will, in ways that are going to be able to speak to everybody, no matter where you are in your skill level. And so definitely look to us at ICMA for resources in the equity space.
And as for the city of San Antonio, I myself took a look at San Antonio's budget equity tool for a piece I was writing on innovative budgeting practices. And I could not recommend the use of that tool more to anyone working on the city budget. It's definitely a very eye-opening way to reevaluate your strategy and looking towards other communities, especially those who are either not in the work yet or just starting the work. What advice do you have for city and county managers out there?
Very good question. Number one, I think people have to understand that this work takes time. It requires some sense of data. You've got to have some data and you've got to go out and get data if you don't have it, right? It requires people. It's impossible for one person in one position to be able to do this work and to move it in a way that's really effective. It requires resources. You have to be able to equip people with the mechanisms of going out and funding an office and funding the work in ways in which you want to change culture within your organizations, but you also want to increase service delivery. I often say this: there is both a moral and an economic imperative to this work. The moral imperative is obvious to most people. We want to create environments that are fair for all people to thrive, period. I think that goes without say. We want to ensure that people feel like as service deliverers and as protectors of people, that governments are working in the best interest of people and not just a few. So that requires some energy, some time, some intentionality, some resources to be able to go out and provide training or to go out and think of how we can use these tools that you mentioned earlier, Jesse, or go out and think about how we can think critically about how we disperse resources and allocate resources in community. All of that takes time and deep and critical thinkers. And so leaders at the top of the spear can think about the economic imperative to say, hey, we're going to have a more thriving, prosperous, economically stable, sound community if we support interventions, particularly in disinvested communities, communities of color, and low income communities where there is need. I think the economics of it demand that, look, we can be extraordinarily high performing cities if we think about trying to ensure that our residents who are worse off have some mechanisms to compete fairly in the marketplace.
That is the last of my questions, but Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough for taking this time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.